So this is just a sharing of some tips that I've learned over the years of identifying those mystery plants, and mainly in Western Canada. So as you've probably seen on the front, you know, when you register, if you've seen on Facebook, if you've seen on Twitter and all, wherever what was shared, we had 3 different plants that was shared on that poster there. And Grama and I were going to do like some kind of mystery bingo thing. So I'm not going to really do that, but I'm going to reveal the names of the plants on that poster as we go along here, and kind of point out a few little features to kind of help, just kind of give you an idea of what I look for when identifying them, and how they kind of present themselves as far as their characteristics are concerned. So we have this plant, and then we have plant something like this, and we're kind of wondering, well, how do I identify this? Well, I'll give you a little hint. The plant on the right is where plants like this we're going to be talking most about. The plant on this side, on the right here, this is just as an aside, this is actually a fungal rust. This is not a plant, a flower as it is. So that's kind of I thought that was a neat thing, because when I found that out, didn't learn that in university, but that's something. So anyway, you have wondered where do I start? Here we go. And we have some people that are not muted. There we go. So just to give you an idea, there are over 2,000 species of plants identified in Alberta alone. So that's a lot of plants to go through. There are 650 genre or the genus, and there's 120 families that have been identified so far. And around 370 species of all those 2,000 are actually considered exotic or natives. And around 9 of those natives are actually subspecies or variants of what's considered native here in this province. And a lot of these native exotics are either garden escapees or species that are been deliberately brought in for the purpose of agriculture, such as forage grasses and legumes that have been naturalized in a lot of plant communities and have been used since they brought over for feed. So many of these species are, a lot of them are tough to find, or they're not found often. A lot are rare or endangered. Many are obscure, or just not in the right place. And others are super common, found almost everywhere, known by almost everyone, considered a weed, which are still not in the right place, and just overlooked due to its regularity. And grasses are certainly that kind of thing. So so this is where I'd like to share a few tips here. The thing is that ask questions first. You know, the old saying, shoot first and ask questions later. It's the whole weed thing, but asking questions, that's where you're going to be able to identify. So my primary focus tonight is going to be with the grasses, the forbs, and the shrubs. And my mission is to help you see the flora diversity that's in Alberta, and start to ask why this plant is here, instead of, is this a weed and how do I get rid of it? Because that is a very common question I get, especially when I'm consulting with producers and that. So knowing a species gives you great ability to better identify those virtues. And of course, this saying is pretty famous. What is a weed? A plant whose virtues haven't yet been discovered. That's by Ralph Waldo Emerson. So here's some things to discuss tonight that I'm going to be talking about. My thing about names, why they're important. I'm going to be talking about how to identify, in other words, what I call the process of elimination, with the leaves and the flowers, how to take pictures of plants, how I take pictures of plants, there's some tips in there. And if you have any photos to send in to someone like me, how to do that, some recommended resource, and then of course, closing remarks. So names are super, super important. You see this particular green photosynthetic plant. Sometimes some plants are not even green. They're some parasitic. I'll talk about that in a little bit here. But names are important because they'll figure out, is it good for the animals to eat? Is it edible? Does it have medicinal properties? Is it deadly poisonous for people and their animals? Is it a noxious invasive weed? Is it a native plant? Or is it a non-native naturalized garden or a crop escapee or like a weed? Should I get rid of it or should I just leave it alone? How can I manage it? And what other properties are there to know about? And all these questions can be answered once you've identified that plant. So the conundrum has always been, what's the best way to go by naming plants? Is it the scientific or is it the common? So for example, let's go with bluegrass. Now bluegrass is, there we go. What's going on here? There we go. Bluegrass. When you hear bluegrass, automatically you're probably going to assume that it's just a grass that's found in a slough, right? Grasses and sloughs and riparian areas are technically bluegrass, right? Or wetland, or that kind of thing. The reality is that, and this is from the Alberta Native Plant Council website, I looked up and I found they had a very nice laid out Excel spreadsheet. And I didn't bother counting the species in there because it would take way too much time. And what I found is that there's actually well over 100 different species of grasses that are found in or near wetlands, and that includes riparian areas. And you'd be surprised some of the species that are in there you wouldn't think would be in there. And that's mainly because of just differences in the biome. So like prairie versus northern boreal forest. What may be considered dry in further north, too dry for those grasses would actually do better in the riparian areas, in the dry prairie areas. So for example, when you're looking at bluegrass, the bluegrass, how it goes by, there's more than just bluegrass. This picture that I took back on our home, this is actually what's called American bluegrass, or Beckmanius exactly. And this is just one species of grass that grows in the wetlands. There's many others, but I don't have enough time to go through that. So, and I don't want to bore you to death with that. So let's go for another example here. What about the dandelion? You've always heard the term dandelion, and you know what it means, but did you know that there's many other different common names for the dandelion? Well, here's a bunch of names here for dandelion: bitterwort, bulbul, pissenbed, pissenlit, priest crown, Irish daisy, lion's tooth, puffball, and all these other ones. But there's only one scientific name for dandelion, that is Taraxacum officinalis. And that is a universal name that everybody around the world knows or should know. And that refers to the dandelion. So the arguments that I have, and I don't discuss too much with people, but it's, the argument is that what is better? Is it scientific is better than the common, or vice versa? The conundrum is that the scientific name is certainly harder to memorize and even tougher to pronounce. Like this plant here. Can you say Alipacurus arundinaceus? See, I have trouble saying it too. And there's other ones too. So you see that name and it's a Latin name and you think, I can't pronounce that. It's just creeping meadow foxtail. And yet, such names make it much easier to narrow down to that species level. And you're not fighting with all these different common names that actually could refer to other different species. Because that was another example I didn't have time to pull up, but that is a thing that I certainly found. And the way to make it easier to narrow down to the species level is using dichotomous keys. And there are books that are with dichotomous keys on the ANP website, Alberta Native Plant Council website. They have a lot of dichotomous keys to look into, which is fantastic. And the other bonus is that there's less names to wrangle with in conversation, so you're not getting easily confused by one species over another. It's universally accepted versus what you'd call local jargon. So where do you begin? Is that ever the question? Now, I want to actually tell you a story about where I got started with plant identification. And I won't take too long because I know I'm going to be limited for time, but it all started in one of my electives I took in university. I actually bachelor of science from the U of A. It's actually an animal science major, but since I've been so interested in plants and ecology, I thought, let's take ENCS 406 here. And this is the plant communities of Western Canada. And so basically the lab, there's the lecture part where you're learning about the plant communities, but the lab part, that was the real learning curve, the fun part. And it was basically allowing students like me, and there was probably about 30 of us, question the capacity to memorize 120, I'm not kidding about this, different species of plants of Western Canada. That's quite a bit. So this includes grasses, forbs, shrubs, and some trees, but not a whole lot. It was mainly the first three that we focused on quite a bit. And in their quizzes, or final exam or midterm, and during our lab, the only things we had to use to identify as we went to these different stations was a twig or the tiny leaflet. And sometimes it would be this big sheet of I remember one quiz, there was this giant sheet of newspaper covering one of the herbarium, and there's this little leaflet cut out. There's a little cutout of this little leaflet, and we had to identify the tribe or the family name of that plant, the genus, its species name, and common name of that sample. And for some students, it was mission impossible, but for others, it was a challenge accepted. So with 120 different species of plants, from prairie to boreal, I mean, the learning curve that I had, all the studying of all the different herbariums of dried plants was quite fun. One of the other things that we had to do for our final was we had a fresh, or not frozen, a frozen but not fresh mystery plant that we had to look under the microscope with. And we had to key down down to the species name. Good luck. So that was found up the key that I ended up going through the school of hard knocks and got the wrong plant. It ended up being a very common plant that I've seen before. So I've learned my lesson in that lab, and I've gotten better ever since. So that's kind of my slightly funny story with that. So now in this application with you guys, this kind of class, I wouldn't call it a class, it's just more a webinar. Where I begin is always the process of elimination. So it's basically, you got to start from the most obvious. Process of elimination, think of it like a funnel, right? Or you have this funnel and you're funneling all this information in. You've got this book full of plants and multiple different possibilities, but you have to start narrowing down. So where do you start? You start from, where did you find the plant? Was it in a forest or grassland? Was it on wasteland? Is it in a wetland? And then what is it? Is it grass or grass-like? Is it herbaceous broadleaf or a forb? Is it a woody species? How does it grow? What is its growth habit? And when is it growing? Like what time of year, and what kind of growth stage is it? All these things are just some of the things you can start to start narrowing down what your mystery plant is. So I'm going to start with grasses and grass likes because that's my favorite subject, but it's probably going to be kind of the most challenging for probably most. And this is with grasses, sedges, and rushes. And grasses, sedges, and rushes are simpler, and yet they are still more challenging than forbs and shrubs. So you look on the left here in this picture of orchard grass. I mean, you see the long, narrow, pale vein leaves and the non-showy seed head, or what's called the inflorescence, that's basically the flower of the grass. I mean, it looks like the leaves, like the leaves of grass you see in your lawn. It's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's you don't really see all that much indifference. And of course, the common thing, well, they all look the same to me. If I heard that, if I had a dollar every time I heard that, so it said to me, I'd be a rich woman, I tell you. So, but to me, because certified plant nerd, the grasses are not all the same to me. So this is why I want to share some things with you here. So a little ditty, especially with grasses, sedges, and rushes, that I've remembered and I've stuck with me forever. It's going to stick with me until the day I die, is this. Sedges have edges, rushes are round. Grasses have nodes from their heads to the ground. Let me say that again. Sedges have edges, rushes are round. Grasses have nodes from their heads to the ground. Grasses are also hollow too, versus sedges and rushes tend to be pithy. I think rushes are more hollow, but yeah. So you notice that sedges here, this is a sedge, this is a common beak sedge, and you can see in the stem, when you feel along the stem, it feels there's a distinct edge. Grasses, they're round. When you feel the stem, they're always round, and they're the little nodes as they grow up. And rushes are also always round. They're always round right to the very tip. So that's a cute little ditty to remember. So here's some things that some illustrations. Most of these that I did from some other books, but basically these are from my own hand here. These are just the different plant parts that show you parts of the grass plant. So with grasses, where you start again, you could start from the biggest down and narrow things down. So you start with growth habit. Is it a creeping grass or is it a bunch grass? And creeping grasses usually have this rhizome. Crackgrass is a common one. And stolons. Barnyard grass is one that tends to have stolons, and they go along the ground, they root in, and as you can see here. height, how tall is the grass? Sometimes environment notes how tall grass is going to be, so you're going to have variance, but basically not all grasses are going to be, not all species are going to be growing the same. So some are going to be super short, some are going to be pretty tall, and that's a great way to determine what you're dealing with. Leaf structure is another one. So leaf structure is basically the how whether the leaf is lax like this, if it's curved under, or whether it's straight out and it's stiff, and also whether you see any shiny above or below the leaf, how wide it is, how long it is, how many leaves there are, those kind of things. And the collar region is a big one. Actually, both collar region and inflorescence are big, but I'll talk about collar region here first because I have inflorescence later in a slide here. So the collar region is actually the base of the leaf here, if you can see my mouse. And the collar region there's three key elements here to remember. There's a ligule, which is this membranous part. So when you peel back the leaf, it'll stick up, and you'll see, look like my thumb, you see this is the leaf, this is the ligule right here. And you'll see this pop out as you gently pull the leaf back. And the other one is the auricle. Those are the claws that go around the stem like this, you can see. And then there's the sheath. The sheath is how the stem kind of closes around that base of the leaf that turns into a stem. And these parts are important, especially when you don't have an inflorescence to look at. Looking at the collar region is certainly a great way to know what kind of species you're dealing with, or at least what kind of genus you're looking at. Because some grasses can be pretty hard to narrow down to species if you don't know what else to look for. So with the ligule is always, there's several different types. So there's the membranous. They're either tall or they're short. They're either like a millimeter or several millimeters long. They're membranous, or they come in really quite the hairs that come out the sides here. Sometimes the ligule isn't even present. Fescue, they tend to not have that. And just look at my notes here. Yeah, the shape, its height, and if there's any ragged edges, because some ligules are not all ligules are going to be smooth like this drawing here. A lot of them can be quite ragged here. They just look like they've been torn. And if they're even present or not. The second one is the auricles, and sometimes the auricles are not even there in a plant. So that's also a feature. Some plants like the brome species, they tend to not have auricles, versus the wheat grasses tends to be like quack grass is Agrippine repens. That's the only. It tends to. You can really see the claws that are just grasping that stem. That's quite pronounced. The sheath is, it can either be open or closed. So open means that it's like kind of like a V and it just goes right down, or it's just like almost like this. So that's the collar region. So several things to pay attention to there when you're identifying. So when you're looking at grass, just don't be afraid to take a leaf and just gently peel it back and look at the collar and what it's looking at, what's looking back at you there. The inflorescence is another interesting thing. So there's actually 4 different types. There's only 3 that are pictured here, but there's actually 4 primary types. The first one is the spike. The spike is pretty familiar if you know wheat or barley. Those are those species have spikes. So basically, the spike of a grass does not have any branching at all. The spikelets are right to the very axis of the inflorescence here. And I should go back here one sec here. Okay, this is quickly here. This is the floret of a grass. So this is what's the looking at the spike here. So this should actually be the spikelet, and this should be like the floret. So this is kind of mixed up, but basically these are, when you're looking at the inflorescence, these are the flowers of the grass that you're looking at. And some are not as lovely as this. Some have spikelets that are kind of like stacked up like that on one branch, that kind of thing. So with the spikes, the spikes are common with the Agropyron species, or Pascopyron, with Pascopyron smithii, which is a western wheatgrass, and they're always going to be in that wheat. Hordeum like Hordeum jubatum, which is Foxhole Barley. That's a classic spike. You would know that you have these really long awns that come off the seed, off the inflorescences, makes it look quite pretty. Then there's a raceme. The raceme is basically a singular branch coming off the axis here, and on each branch there's either one or more spikelets or florets that are on there. So it's just kind of a more simply branched Hesperostepa or the cyper, the needle grasses like porcupine grass or the needle and thread grass. Those are the ones that are pretty common. And brome tends to be the one with the raceme. I think I might be wrong. Some might have a more the simpler panicle, but most that I've seen have the raceme. In the panicles tend to be many branches, so they come in twos or they come in threes. Here I kind of went overboard, but we did. Oh yeah, these are threes, fours, and see if you count the number of branches that come off the branch from the panicle, from the axis, which is the basic, which is again the center point, and you can see that. So Dantonia, which is the oak grass species, those are common. Poa, which are the bluegrasses, another characteristic of it, and Festuca, or the fescus, they're always in panicles. Now that brings me to the one thing that was missing, I did not put in here, and that's the comb. The comb of the grass is actually, it's not too common. Well, the species is fairly common, but for the most part, as far as seen in multiple different species, it's not that common. So the comb is actually and the Bouteloua species. So on this next slide, I'll show you what a comb looks like. So this is actually blue Grama, and blue Grama is a cute, tiny little grass that it grows out in the prairie out there, and I call them like Grama's eyebrows because they look just like Grama's eyebrows. And one other characteristic of blue Grama is this short curly grass that you always see, and they common in the prairie, that the old buffalo wallows and what you call the blue Grama blowouts or the Bouteloua blowouts, and that's where a lot of these grasses tend to proliferate. Another example is the this thing, and this shows you not the spider, not looking at the spider. It's the panicle, and this is actually Kentucky bluegrass. So this cute little spider, actually she's a she's making a nest. She's going to be birthing soon, but this is last year. But you can kind of see, you can really see how the branching happens with Poa pratensis here. That's a good example of a panicle. And my third example is that of Pumpleys Brawl. or Bromus pumpilianus. See, scientific names are hard to pronounce, but they're still worth saying. So this is a raceme. You can see from the axis here, right, this main part here, you can see that there's branching that just comes off that primary axis there of Pumpleys. And this is very, very similar with smooth brome as well. And the final one is Foxhole Barley. So you can see this in a spike. See where the seed head, the seeds are just right along this axis here, and there's no branching in. So with sedges and rushes, sedges and rushes, there's the primary characteristics for sedges is going to be the flowering, as well as the rushes is always the flowers. I just want to, just for kicks and giggles here, to compare the collar region here. The collar region is basically, in all sedges, they have a distinct ligule, which you can kind of see here that I drew. And rush collar, they have not quite a ligule, but the sheath is, the sheath is very open. So unlike the rush, the ligule is, the sheath is very closed off. So it's just like, there's not very much that's not very many sedges have wide open sedges. Like, so if you're looking at what you think is a sedge that has an open sheath, it might actually be a rush. So you just feel along the edge, feel for those edges there. Now the flowers, the flowers of sedges and rushes are quite interesting because most sedges have the separate male and female inflorescences on one plant, and most rushes do not. I'll talk about that in a little bit here. There's these tepals which surround the ovary in rushes. So you can see these, they kind of look racks, but they're also called tepals. And they come in different colors, that kind of thing. And what you'd call, so there's different difference between tepals here and then the bract or bracts that are seen in the sedge. Now, the thing about sedges are probably the most hardest grass-likes to identify. They're extremely hard to identify, and actually impossible to identify when they're vegetative. So if you see what you think is a sedge and you don't see any flowers on it, don't bother identifying, because you won't be able to get to where you need to go because they really do look the same, and the vegetative parts of sedges are just so similar, unlike grasses, where identifying them down to the species level is extremely hard. So this brings me to the inflorescences here. So there's two different types of the flowers here. There's the male flowers, and they appear either above the female flowers, or which is androgynous, or the below, which is gynecandrous, and they can be either distinctly in a spike above or even below, or they can be just one single spike where males are either on top or on the bottom of the flowers. The perigyna, which is the part of the female part of the sedge, which surrounds the achene, which is the seed. Go back here. And they come in very different shapes and sizes in themselves. So they can be winged, they can be lance or orbicular, like really wide and almost look like they're kind of pregnant. They can be beaked or not beaked, or winged, not winged, all that kind of that stuff. So there's just so many different shapes and sizes. Now, as an aside, sedges are, I know when I was taking when I took the NCS 406 lab, the ladies who did the TAs for the lab said that sedges are indeed the hardest, and there's a reason why, and it's because the carex in the genus Carex, there's actually 130 species of sedges just in the Carex genus alone that are in Alberta, and that's quite a few to have to get through in order to know what kind of sedge you're dealing with. So knowing what these different sizes, and in kind of taking all these into account to help you identify what kind of sedge you're looking at, that's very helpful. So this is a rush. You can kind of see the tepals here, and this is not quite flowering. It's almost ready to open up, but not quite. And it's what's called the Baltic Rush. Another example, in this one, earlier this afternoon, I was keying this one out, and I'm fairly certain that it's a straw sedge or Carex phoenia. And the reason is the way that the characteristic of the spike itself, and not so much the way these structures are, but just how they're kind of bends, the spike kind of bends with the wind, and kind of just the structure of that spike. So I'm going to give you a little bit of mind break here, because we're getting halfway through. So just a quick little thing here. So what do you call a plant that's running like? It's called a rush. Now I have another one here. Two friends, S and Edge, went hiking one day. They had been planning on starting a business together and needed the hike to discuss one topic of contention: what to name their company. They talked at great length and still had not come to an agreement. Suddenly they happened across a botanist busy snapping photos in the middle of a wetland just off the trail. Curious Edge called out, "Hey, what are you looking at?" The botanist looked up and replied excitedly, "A beautiful plant called Carex equatilis." The two friends looked at each other, and S blurted out, "What the heck is that?" She says, "A sedge, of course." It was as if a bomb dropped on them. At that moment, both knew exactly what their company was going to be called: Sedge Incorporated. Okay, moving on to forages. Moving on to forbs. So forbs and shrubs have quite the variety. There's many different colors, many different leaf shapes and arrangements, many different flower types and arrangements, different growth habits. They can be found in literally any biome or plant community you can think of. And they usually go in two different categories that we like to put them into, either weeds or wildflowers. Some of them are both. They're pretty easy to spot, but are they ever a challenge to identify? And certainly these plants attract the most "what plant is that?" inquiries for me. So when you're narrowing down to, at least to the family part of the plants, there's of these forbs, you have to look at the structural components. So mainly the leaves and the flowers we're going to be looking at. Now there's a set of questions to keep in mind for both of these structural components. That is how they're arranged on the stem, what shape they are, what size they are, and what the coloration is. The other thing is, what is their growth habit? Are they erectile, like a singular erectile, or they cluster from the crown? Are they creepers? Do they creep on us from a stolon, or just that you see in the grasses? There's a runner that comes above ground, or are they rhizomatous, which are runners that roots that creep out from below ground and stem shoots up that way. And creepers also tend to be mat forming plants. There's the third one are the climbers. And the climbers always have these tendrils, these beautiful little tendrils, and they climb on plants, they climb on anything they can to get to sunlight. And the fourth one is the parasitic or the saprophytic types. The saprophytic types they make their living from the organic matter, or from fungi, or they are parasitic, so they grow off of different plants. Most saprophytic plants, except those that are partially saprophytic, do not have any chlorophyll, so they cannot photosynthesize. So they basically have either white, they're red, or they're a brown color, and they certainly pop up because they look like this strange creature, strange organism that's on the ground. Orchids, like the lady slipper orchid, most orchids are partially saprophytic, but a lot of them, so that means that they form a special relationship with a particular fungi that grows that's in the ground, so that they can use that fungi for nutrients and for nutrient transport, and to basically to grow and to proliferate. So let's keep in mind with narrowing down with forbs and shrubs. We have 120 different plant species in Alberta, and that includes the grasses, but if we didn't include the grasses and the sedges and the rushes, it's still about 120 different plant families in Alberta. Not plant species, I said plant species, it's actually plant families. So it's impossible to go through them in the remaining time I have here. And I'm probably running short of time, but I'll try to go as quick as I can here. So you're grouping plants by family, you're going by defining the different characteristics of the different families. So I don't have time to go through these, but family, so there's the aster family, which is like the family where sunflowers and dandelion and aster and all that they're in. And usually that's the flowers. So I'll be going, I'll show you what kind of characteristics are very unmistakably the Asteraceae. And then there's a family, Fabaceae, which is legume, or the pea family. And there's some neat, distinct characteristics with those. With the flowers that look like a pea, and then of course the leaves that are quite divided. Family Rosaceae, which is the rose family, the cinquefoil, rose and raspberry, I think, are in that family, and always have stipules and perfect flowers that are 5 petals. Then there's Liliaceae, which is can be confused with orchids, but they're the Liliaceae, the lily family, they always have the 6 petals, long linear leaves, but they're much fatter wider than the grass family. And then there's a Brassicaceae, which is the brassica family, or mustard, the mustard family. And that's where you see flowers that are the 4 petals, and the leaves are quite varied, but they're most brassicas, they tend to grow quite tall. So the main question is, how do you know what these defining characteristics are? Well, this is where we're gonna go next. So the first thing is we're gonna go is the leaves. So the leaves, you can see there's many different shapes of, say, for simple leaves. And what's the fun about these of simple leaves is that not every leaf is going to be exactly textbook, like shaped like these. There's a lot of leaves that are going to be linear lanceolate, or a combination of most any of these, which can be confusing. But basically, you know that what the linear would be something like a willow leaf, elliptical, or ovate, typical of a poplar tree, and those kind of examples. Or cordate is also that of a poplar. And these leaves in themselves, there's always particular ones that are pretty defining of to what a plant species in. This one particular is a shield shape. So this is the stem, goes right to the center of the leaf, and the veins branching out from there. Next one is we have the types, divided leaves. Now, divided leaves are going to be either like this, where they're not completely down, completely to the edge or the very axil of the leaf, and others are going to be so divided that they're forming tiny ducts to branching. So they're actually the interesting one. So moderately or deeply divided, and each of these you can see, but they still have a single leaf. So these, and then of course, like I said, you have all these sub leaves. But botanists like these are not, each of these are actually not called leaves. These are called leaflets. So this whole thing is actually, this whole entire thing that comes off the branch is actually a leaf in itself. And these are just leaflets that come off from the main branch there. Sometimes as I mentioned before, that's the types of leaves that the lines can get pretty blurred. Whether divided leaves are textbook like, or whether they're divided, and they could be either compound, pinnate, trifoliate, or digitate. And now there is some confusion between palmate and digitate. They're basically the same thing, but think of a palm leaf versus the human hand. So the palm leaf and the human hand are pretty similar, but if you're going to think about digitate, you see here, these are going to be, you hold out your hand and they're like finger-like projections, and the palmate are like the leaves of a palm tree. So hence the original names that botanists come up with when to define these leaves. So these are actually, palmate and digitate are interchangeably used, but they basically notify that the leaves, how divided these leaves are. Trifoliate is like a clover leaf. There are other plants that have a trifoliate but are not in the legume family. So those are the divided leaves here. Next, we have the leaf edges, and here you can kind of see that there's leaves that are rolled under, or rolled either inward or under, ripple leaves, smooth, and then there's the toothed leaves, or either they're round or they're sharp, or even you have leaves that have a fine hair along the edge or even on the surface. And then with the leaves, there's so many different leaf types. And leaf types are like what's arranged on how they're arranged on the stem. You can see for yourself all the many different types of arrangement on the leaves here. So there's everything from winged, from clasping, foliate, stalkless, you name it, it's on there. But the thing about a lot of these leaves is young plants tend to be a little bit different from the adults. So there's plants that have rosettes at emergence. And then as they get taller, they start to lengthen out and they start to form these different leaves as they start reaching maturity. So that can make life interesting when trying to identify what this rosette is. But So you're not going by rosette, you're going kind of back to what I talked about with the different leaf shapes. And then you identify from there. So those are the leaves. Now I want to show some examples of different leaves here. So you could see here on this plant that was on the poster there, see how they're arranged on the stem. You can kind of see here they're alternate and they're quite long and narrow. They're linear. And this is a better example. This is actually a member of the aster family, and it's called a dotted blazing star, Liatris punctata. My next example is this beauty, which is the member of the mint family. You can see how the leaves are actually they're not alternate, but they're opposite on the stem. That's typical of mints. All mints, mint family, they all have these opposite leaves on there. And the leaves that are attached, they have slight bit of a wing, but there's the base is just, there's no stem, or there's no branching. And this is called the rough bugleweed. The naughty word, I guess you could say, is the water whorehound. So it's the way you know this apart from the mint, the wild mint, is that all the flowers are going to be along the right at the base of the leaf. Whereas a wild mint, the leaves there's no flowers at the base of each leaf, but they're actually at the top of the plant. And then this one, I thought I'd put this one in because cacti are very interesting. So what about cacti? Now, cacti are super interesting because everybody probably thinks, you see this big green part and you think that's leaf. That's actually not true. This is the stem. This green part is the stem. The spines are the leaves. So the spines do not have chlorophyll. They don't need them because they're just too tiny. So the chlorophyll is actually more in the stems, and that's where the cacti gets a lot of stores its nutrients, gets its energy to grow, and does its flowering there. Now, cacti are certainly pretty easy to notice and identify. But funny story, they're even more noticeable when you're in rapture of taking a closer look at another plant nearby, and you end up with a bunch of those sharp tines in your sharp spines in your knee. That's a true story. So I did that. And I had to spend 5 minutes with my tweezers pulling out all the spines out of my kneecap. Oh, fine in botany. That's called brittle prickly pear cactus. So now let's talk about stems here. There's not much exciting with the stems, but they can be relevant. So it certainly depends on the species. What are their shape? Are they round? Or they have some kind of edging on them? Are they hollow? Are they pithy? Do they have hairs or are they hairless? How tall is it? Is it very short? Is it very long? And sometimes even coloration is important. Like if there's went too fast. If there's any purpling, if it's spotted, and that kind of thing. So for a good example here is a smooth false dandelion, or Grossis glauca. You can see how right from when it's flowering, it just shoots up this huge long stem with a single flower at the top. Remember the aster family. Now, speaking of flowers, the things with flowers to pay attention to is the color. And this is one of my favorite apps I use. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But you have many different colors to look at. And then you have the number of petals. And what's not so much number of sepals, but what the shape of the sepals are. And some plants, it's their petals are just so tiny that all you have is the sepals to look at, or the tepals for some species. And another one is in a major family called Asteraceae, is all you have is the ray. You have two different types of flowers, and they're the rays, which are not true flowers, and the florets, which are the tiny true flowers that are the reproductive parts of the asters and dandelion and all that. The last one to pay attention to is the size. How big are these flowers? Are they very, very tiny? Are they pretty big? There's some key features to help identify with size with the flower there. So these are the different flower parts here. So form flowers are certainly some of the most fascinating works of what I call Mother Nature art because of their minute parts, how they're made up and how delicate they really are. Even the tiniest flowers bear the tiniest detail. But not for that. Most form flowers bear petals, which are the most attractive parts of the flower, and below that are the sepals, you can see here, which will most likely have some structural components. The flowers, especially after blooming. Sometimes these sepals, they close in after and close the seed, or help just keep the seed in. The entire flower, which includes the petal, stamen, style, and stigma, are what we call the corolla. And no, that's not the make of a car. You've probably noticed that petals are either divided down into the sepals or joined together. Wintergreen is illustrated above, which is this plant right here, is a good example. Another example are harebells or lungwort, which you'd probably be best known as the bluebells. What about symmetry? Flowers can be either radially symmetrical, like you can see here. You can see there's about 3 different ways that it's symmetrical, or they're just bilaterally symmetrical. Many different flowers like hawkweed, asters, wild rose, and bunchberry are radially symmetrical. Orchids and members of the pea family are bilaterally symmetrical. So bilaterally, there's only one line you can draw down, and that's where they're symmetrical, like a mirror image, and cut one half. So remember too, from when I talked the last slide, the number of petals a plant has. Defining characteristics like 5 or 4 petals or 3, or even more than what count is so important in narrowing down that plant to its taxonomic family. The other thing is that where the situation of the ovary is. So here, this is a superior ovary, which is above the sepals here, or below it. And so this would be a pretty good example with this would be like the rose hips, I think. Another one is flower shapes. So there's many different types of shapes of flowers you can see here. And I won't spend too much time because these are pretty self-explanatory. Now for family Asteraceae, whoops, went backwards here. Family Asteraceae, which is also called Compositaceae, but Asteraceae, aster family, they're what you call the compound flowers. And they have both ray and tubular florets. The tubular florets are the true flowers, like I said, and the rays are just what attracts pollinators and what makes the plant look pretty. And there's 3 different types. There's this one, the sunflower. There's this type, and then there's this type, which I think is, or the looks similar to a dandelion, and this is like a hawkweed. Then there's the involucre, which is the base of the flower, and these are basically the sepals, another species. So there's just 3 main different types and different scales. I'll identify that. Then the seeds come with or without a pappus, and the pappus is basically the hairy, the dandelion buzz of the attached to the seed there, and the pappus is what would help the seed travel quite the far distance. Cirsium, so for example, cirsium, which is a thistle, some of them have quite short. Glaredia, Ratibida, which is a cone flower, they have a very basic type of seed. Helianthus is a the probably the absolute basic type. And then you have Tragopogon, which is goat's beard. That has a very long pappus, a very long stalk for the pappuses, and they travel quite the far distance. And the last one for flowers is what kind of arrangement they are. So many of them are arranged similar to grasses, but there's other different characteristics. And basically how they're arranged on the stem. So like a spike, if there's just no branching at all, or if there's interesting branching, like it's in the shape of an umbrella, if there's different panicles branching in interesting ways. The other thing is that where are they situated with relative to the leaves? Are they situated above the leaves? Are they clustered at the base of each leaf, like you've seen back with the rough bugle weed? Or are they at the top? They're terminal. Like they're way above the leaf. They're not like the leaf is just kind of above it, but they're still there. They're just right there at the very top. And they arrange the other arrangements is that there could be just a single terminal flower at the top, or as you see here, there are many different types, many different flowers at the top, arranged in ways like this. So here's some examples of flowers here. And this is a blue-eyed grass, and one of the pictures that was shown in the poster that it's also blue-eyed grass. And this is a cute little hoverfly that was pollinating blue-eyed grass. And of course, until the day I photographed this little guy doing his duty pollinating, I had no idea that blue-eyed grass, which is a very tiny flower, it's only about that big, how it actually gets pollinated. And there's these fascinating insects that help do the job. The next one is fireweed. And fireweed, you can see how it's arranged on the stem here in a bit of a spike. And of course, the characteristic, they have the four petals. I think I'm counting right tonight because I had a long day today. But that's one way that you can see the way the flowers. The other thing I didn't talk about was how talking about arrangement on the stem, how flowers tend to bloom. So there's some plants that they flower all at once, or when they're on a spike, they actually start from the bottom and then work their way up. Fireweed is a great example because you can see, but the bottom here, these are the seed pods that are starting to form. And this is after the flowers. So you can see these are the old flowers, and the newest ones are at the top. So for each time, so basically it's the fireweed's way of both attracting pollinators and extending the life of new flowers that are going to be bursting into bloom probably in a couple of days since I took this photo, and then seed pods that are starting to form seeds. Now there's other flowers I didn't talk about. There's the not so noticeables. These are the tiny green flowers that just look like they're just green, right? You don't really notice them. For some of them, the flower petals are actually called tepals. And most often, a lot of these ones are known as the weeds, or the ugly sisters of the foreworld. And these ugly sisters, which are called, all the of the foreworld, and called weeds, are the like Amaranthaceae, which are of the Chenopodium. So Chenopodium things like lamb's quarters, or pigweed is another example of this family. And if you've ever noticed lamb's quarters or pigweed, you notice that there's no showy, pretty flowers like in blue-eyed grass or anything like that. They're just green and ugly. Hence the name, the ugly sisters of the foreworld. Another one's a little bit more prettier is the plantain and the member of the Plantagenaceae family. So if you've seen common plantain that grows out on the sidewalks or on the trails, and you go and go hiking, there's other different species other than common plantain. There's the native plantains, but those are other examples of species that don't have the flowering, the noticeable flowering. This family, Equisetaceae, is the horsetail. So they're also the ones that don't have showy flowers. And then Orchidaceae also has a few plants that aren't that showy. And this is one good example that I found just purely by accident. It's called the green frog orchid, and cute little story. And I had no idea what this plant was, so I put it on the Facebook plant. I did Alberta Native Plant group, and one of the ladies there pointed out that it was an orchid, and I tell you, I got pretty excited. So this stalk right here, this is actually the stalk from last year's bloom. This is one. This is pictured in I think 2019, 2018. But anyway, this is from the year prior, and this is the current year that just finished blooming. So I just missed it. And of course, there's other families that have those ugly sister, not so noticeable flowers. Now let's go to shrubs. So these shrubs are the woody plants, and the most characteristics are pretty equivalent to forbs. Others are just other characteristics are exclusive to woody plants. So things like the bark, you see the leaf scars, like right here in the willow species, you can see the leaf scar right there, noticeable buds, and that there's woody tissue throughout. So there's cambium, there's not just primary xylem and phloem, but there's a secondary xylem and phloem that is very characteristic for woody plants. If you have a twig, that's basically all you need to identify to species level. One exception is that if it's a willow, well, I could probably only identify it to willow, to salix, but beyond that, it's not going to be that fun to identify down to species level, because willow is just as bad as the sedges for the complication and need for the for either the lens, there's a little lens you can look closer, or even a dissecting microscope. So with the willows is, with the shrubs and willows, it's always the easiest with the leaves and the flowers that are included, or because I still have sedges on my mind. Sorry, willows, because they tend to flower in the springtime. You have either identifying them in the spring or after flowering when their leaves are quite pronounced and quite noticeable. So add all these up, and what do you get? Well, I would call a start. And I know that I looked through so many different characteristics. I didn't exactly, do point out this is that plant, this is what all the characteristics are, because I think that would be just super boring. But all these characteristics, and you compile them all together and use that process of elimination, go down that funnel, and all of a sudden you take, you note what all these different characteristics are and put them all together. Then you get that species and that common name. And you have an ability to identify its botanical qualities. So whether it's medicinal, poisonous, it's invasive or native, and what other qualities there are with it. But a major tip is that don't jump to conclusions. Especially if you're new at this and you're not certain, don't jump to conclusions. Check idea, then check again, and double and triple check just to be sure. And I always do this because since there's over 2,000 different species of plants just in Alberta alone, it's so easy to get species mixed up, to get wrong ID. Mistaken IDs always happens. And of course, if you see a species often enough, you're gonna definitely know that what it is. I know. I think I would like to talk. If I had more time, I would talk quite a bit more about these four things, but I just don't have enough time to do that tonight. So, but it would probably hint, Amber. It would probably be a really cool idea to maybe do a future webinar, just looking at different plants and their some of the most notable plants with their medicinal, poisonous, or edible properties. And I think that'd be kind of neat. So, but if you're typing away in the comments there, maybe let us know and see what you think about that, whether that's a good idea. And let me go next here. So, but if you're still unsure, if you still don't know what that plant is, well, here's some more tips of what to do. When you see that plant, you have a camera, or if you know where it is and you forgot the camera, get out there and take some photos of it. Take lots of photos, and I'll show you how later. Note where you found it and when. And then if you have books, plant identification books, check them out, see what you can find in there. Check your plant ID apps, and maybe Google image search. That's kind of my last resort if I can't find anything at all in any of the books or ID, or if I have to verify everything. And last but certainly not the least is ask an expert. And send in your photos, because I'm always happy to help, or people like me are always happy to help to help you identify what you're looking at there. So here's some photography tips, and this is a webinar in itself, and I'll just be very brief because I am definitely over time here, but there's so much cool information to show. So all you need is your phone and a point and shoot camera. And you don't need anything fancy, unlike me, who uses a Canon Rebel T6i. That's my camera I use, or just a plain old iPhone. So the pictures that you really need to take is a whole plant, plus the leaves, plus the flowers and other details. So my thing is, and this is getting to be a bit of a thing with me, is as much as possible, avoid picking or pulling up that plant unless you're absolutely sure that it's a weed and you see others and you know it's a common plant where it's growing. Don't pick it, especially if it's a natural area and it's a plant you haven't seen before. Just leave it there, take pictures of it, and take those pictures back to show your friends, show a botanist, and to identify what you looked at. And then there's the tiny details, which you call the macro photography. So the tiny details are like what I did. These are my fingers here. When I peeled that back, gently peeled back the leaf on this grass to look at the color region. That's kind of macro. Or if you're looking at the flowers here and you want to get a better close-up of these flowers of this, this is what is actually a early local weed, and to get more detail if it's necessary. And if you're getting a whole plant and there's lots of grass around the area, this is what I did. Just gently clear the area, just gently push aside the extra vegetation that's there, and you get a nice picture of a whole plant. The other thing is, where is the sun pointing, especially in a sunny day? Make sure that you are not illuminating your back, but illuminating the plant. So the other thing is that there's photographers talk about overexposure, underexposure, shading. When you shade out the plant, you can easily create too much light in one spot and too much dark in another, and it's really hard to see. It's kind of a bit of a pain. So lighting is always really important. Focus. Number one thing, it's so hard to identify a blurry photo. I can't tell you how many times I've made that mistake. And of course, take multiple photos. Don't be afraid to take multiple different angles, all that kind of stuff. Don't just think that one picture is going to be enough. Sometimes there's multiples that just show all the other different pictures just show what's missing in those other photos. So when you're sending in photos, let's say you've sent in this kind of picture. This is a particular sedge. Make sure you're sending in high resolution photos to a botanist like me. This is very, 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 very important. So when you're doing sending them in, like in my iPhone, this is a screenshot of my iPhone here. And I hope you can see this because my top bar is kind of hiding a little bit. But make sure you send in the large or the actual size. But please do not send any of the small ones like this one, like 104 kilobyte, 50 kilobyte. That's too tiny. So don't send anything that's less than that. So if you have a large photo or actual size, large is good enough. You can certainly blow up the picture back there, because when I'm looking at plants, I'm always taking this photo, and blowing it up, and you can see how pixelated it is when I just blow it up on my phone. And here's an even better example. I can't make anything. I can hardly make anything out of this. I can maybe think I can know it's a sedge. I'm not sure if it's a big sedge, but I need more clarity in this photo right here so that I can clearly see what it is. Another thing is, I stress this, I can't stress this enough, is don't just limit yourself to just one photo. Make sure you take multiple photos and have 5, 10, I don't care, 20 photos. If you have a lot of photos of one plant or different plants, that's awesome. And that means that there's not just one photo to look through, because chances are that one photo won't be showing a particular characteristic that's going to show up in another. And we're always looking through these photos and looking at different angles and blowing up in different ways just to see if we can see that particular characteristic we're looking at to identify that plant down to species level. So that's setting him off. Now, as I'm getting drawn and close here, and my throat is getting very super dry. Here's some recommended resources that I have that I've accumulated over, and these are just a few. This is just a sample. So these are a couple of books, couple of my favorite books that I use. Plants of Alberta, and the recent one, and this is, the copyright is wrong, should be 2020. A vascular flora of Alberta. The illustrated guide. This is a dichotomous key. There's no colored photography or colored photos in here. They're just pencil sketches. But the artist who did the illustrations in this book did a phenomenal job. It was just spectacular, just to how detailed they got each different species and how they identified it. Just took a lot of work to do that. Another one I didn't mention in here, there's a volume, all the Western, I think it's called Western Flora of Flora of Western Canada. It's on my bookshelf over here, but I don't want to grab it. It's by Cacti, and there's a 3-volume set. There's that has shrubs and trees, forbs, big volume of forbs, and grasses and grass lights. Now, phone apps, my favorite one is Wildflowers. iNaturalist and Picture This, I've heard pretty good stuff with them, so those are certainly worth trying out. And then these are some of my favorite websites: Saskatchewan Wildflowers, USDA, XID for weed identification. And this last one is one that I've been working on. This is my own project, because I have tons of photos and so much knowledge that I need to put it out there online to help people, be just one more source people can use for identifying plants. So here's some closing remarks. Plant ID is challenging, but it's definitely rewarding. It opens your eyes to a whole new world of plants. And let me tell you, I'm speaking from experience. the thing about plant ID is that you really need to pay attention to detail, because confusion between different species, between similar species, or species that look similar but are actually different, happens all the time. Make sure you pack a camera wherever you go. If you're going out to just a field or going out in a hike somewhere, that way you know you can take pictures and look back at them later and say, oh, what's that plant? What's that doing there, kind of thing. And finally, if in doubt, consult as many resources as possible, and that includes people as well. And that is my presentation. Thanks for tolerating my long-winded rave of plants.
And next up, we have Kristyn Mayner. Kristyn is with the Alberta Native Plant Council and with Ducks Unlimited as well. So she comes to us with a couple different backgrounds. And other than that, like, we've only talked through emails. So this is super cool to learn a little bit more about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, thank you. I'm happy to be here tonight, and I will be representing both organizations at one point or another, but I'm mainly here on behalf of the Alberta Native Plant Council. I'm their communications committee chair. So most of my information that I'm relaying is from them and resources available through the Alberta Native Plant Council. So who are we? We're a not-for-profit organization. We were incorporated in 1988, volunteer driven, and most of our volunteers, have some sort of interest in botany, conservation. Often they're landowners, or they work in the environmental field, or the horticulture industry in many cases. So as an organization, our objectives are to educate Albertans about native plant species, encourage research, and then develop conservation actions for the preservation of natural habitats across the province. And I know that Karin already provided so much information about essentially native plants, although there were a few mentions of weeds here and there. But I thought I would just back up and go right back to the basics. So what is a native plant? So we're talking about those species that occur naturally in Alberta or North America. So they've evolved here over the last, hundreds of thousands of years. And they existed prior to European contact. That's the big caveat. So humans are currently moving species across the globe at unprecedented rates. And there are many introduced species that exist in North America, mostly through introduction into gardens as ornamental species. And often these aren't a problem. They serve a function, they're beautiful plants, but there are the select few of these introduced species that can become highly invasive. They can spread into the natural environment and cause a risk or pose a threat to the natural biodiversity of our province. So these are the weeds. And for more information about weeds, I would direct you to our sister organization, the Alberta Invasive Species Council. So why do we value native plants? So because they evolved here, they're the most resilient species, they're most well-adapted species for our climate, and certainly when we're looking at a future of climate uncertainty, I think that it's really important that we recognize the resilience of our native species and how they'll help us adapt to future climate conditions. They're also extremely important food and shelter for wildlife, and we're talking everything from the large mammals to pollinators. And just a note on the pollinators, there's over, I think, 300 species of native bees in Alberta, and all of those bee species rely on our native wildflowers for pollinating and completing their life cycle. Native plants are also really important food and medicine for people, and particularly Indigenous people. So along the top here, I have a few examples of edible and medicinal plants in the province. So going from left to right, the first photo is a photo I took where I was very fortunate to join a native elder in harvesting what's called rat roots, or northern sweet flag, from a wetland in northern Alberta. So the second photo shows the inflorescence of this species. And basically, the roots are used as a medicine to cure stomach aches or gastrointestinal issues. So that was just a really fulfilling experience for me to be able to participate in harvesting that. The third photo shows wild mint. That might be familiar to some of you as well. It also grows in Alberta wetlands. And then the last photo shows Labrador tea, which grows in some of our peatlands or our muskegs across northern Alberta. And again, as the name implies, is used as a tea by Indigenous people. And then, of course, another reason I enjoy native plants is because they're simply beautiful. There's a huge variety. I find it really fulfilling to enjoy natural ecosystems when I'm hiking, identifying these species when I'm out and about. Okay, so with that little overview of native plants aside, I'm going to provide some more information about projects, publications, and resources that the Alberta Native Plant Council provides for you to dive in and discover Alberta's native plants. So the first one is maybe not the most accessible book. You might not start here if you're just learning about botany in Alberta, but it is a book that the Alberta Native Plant Council publishes. So it is kind of our pride and joy, I'll say. So it's the Rare Vascular Plants of Alberta. So this covers all of the species that are not very common in the province. And we're actually currently working on an update to this book. I think it will be released later this winter or next spring. So it's just a good reference guide if you're working, in the field, perhaps on environmental assessments, and you need to be more aware of where these rare populations of species exist so that we can better protect them. The second resource, and this is the one that I just can't highlight enough for everybody, is the native plant source list that we keep on our website. So it's an Excel spreadsheet that's really, easily searchable. And basically what this lets you do is if you're interested in growing native plants, you can use this list to search for your location in the province and all the known native seed providers that we know of, at least, that exist, so that you can source native plant materials either for your garden or for a restoration project or whatever the case may be. And I think we have close to 100 providers listed here, so it's a really great resource for that purpose. And then, as I mentioned, education is a really large goal of the ANPC, and we have a number of policies and guidelines available on our website if you're interested in doing various things. Some of these are more technical again, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them, but we do have a guideline for, conducting botanical surveys, for doing plant rescues, if there was an area that was going to be disturbed and you had to move the population of plants, and that kind of thing. Some of our more public-facing brochures and publications include the ones I'm showing here. So a really quick guideline document on how you might approach growing native plants from seed. Another one covers rare plants, what they are, and how to decipher some of the terminology around the rankings of rare species. And we have one more that covers weeds in Alberta. But again, for the weeds, I would highly recommend that you go to the Alberta Invasive Species Council website because they have excellent information and fact sheets about weed species in the province. Okay, so I thought I would just spend a little bit of time highlighting some of the most iconic Alberta species. Again, the ANPC has published these fact sheets for our emblems, our provincial emblems. So the first one, of course, is prickly rose, Rosa sicularis. This is our floral emblem of the province. It might be familiar to you all. It's one of 3 rose species that grows in Alberta. The second one is our tree emblem. You may or may not have been aware. It's lodgepole pine, Pinus contorta. And again, we just have a little bit of information here about the species. And then the third one is a little bit trickier. Not often people don't think about what our grass emblem might be. It's a little less iconic. In this case, it's actually a genus of species, rough fescue, or the festuca species. So we have the 3 examples here. I'm not sure if those are the 3 species or if there's more festucas in Alberta. Yeah, maybe somebody can chime in the comments if you know of more. But again, that's just our grass emblem. Okay, so getting back into some of the resources, and some of these are provided by the Alberta Native Plant Council and other ones are just endorsed, I guess, by us. So the first one is the Vascular Flora of Alberta. Karin mentioned this one. It is excellent. So we did not publish it, but we support it for sure. It was produced by Linda Kershaw and Lorna Allen. They spent a lot of time developing these illustrated keys. The illustrations are so important and so well done, helping guide you through some of the terminology for how to identify plant species. So really user-friendly guide. I couldn't recommend it enough. You can purchase it off of Amazon. If you wanted to take it for a whirl without necessarily purchasing it, we also have all of the keys available to download on our website. So you can try it out without committing to buying it. And another thing that the ANPC publishes quarterly is our Iris newsletter. So actually 3 times per year, pardon me. So we just kind of do current events, field trips that we organize in the summer, book reviews, and more in this publication. In non-COVID times, we tended to get together more often. We've been struggling a little trying to find ways to connect virtually with our members, but we do have some online study groups, and we did have 1 field trip last summer. Hopefully there'll be more next summer. So if you're interested in those kinds of things, consider becoming a member and subscribing to our newsletter for more information. We also act as a volunteer steward for 4 different natural areas across the province. And I thought maybe one of the ones I would mention here is Clyde Fen Candidate Natural Area north of Edmonton, because that's actually the field trip we conducted in August of this year, and I was able to attend, and it's just a really beautiful site with a lot of really interesting plant species like orchids, pitcher plants, sundews, really special area. So if you're ever interested in joining us on a field trip, do get in touch. We tend to visit these sites annually and are always looking for volunteer stewards to help us inventory them. Okay, so here's another few slides listing some of the other resources that we would recommend you use to start identifying plants in Alberta. So the first thing that's really important is understanding the terminology behind the different components in plants. Karin covered this so thoroughly. If you need a couple of handy guides, these are 2 that we might recommend that you look up. And then once you have the terminology down, you can get into the keys. So a lot of people who have been botanizing in the province for a really long time would refer to the moss key. It's sort of the, Bible of plant ID for Alberta, but it has been more recently adapted by both John Packer, Joyce Gould in Vascular Plants of Alberta, and then more recently in the illustrated keys that I mentioned by Linda Kershaw and Lorna Allen. So again, these are all keys. They're not as highly visual as perhaps some of the field guides that are out there that you can use that have a lot of pictures, and just perhaps more accessible information about how to identify plants. So I think by far the best one, the one I always carry, is Plants of the Western Forest. And I think this was actually just recently reprinted and re-released. So it's fairly easy to find online. And then a quick overview of some of the other ones that I know of are here. These ones actually all cover the Rocky Mountain areas. And the one on the right, Wildflowers of Whitehorse Wildland Provincial Park, is actually another publication that was produced by the Alberta Native Plant Council volunteers. For trees and shrubs, there's a couple of examples here. If you can see me on my webcam, another one I just pulled up before this presentation that I recently purchased is called Guide to the Common Trees and Shrubs of Alberta. It's produced by Inside Education, and it's really excellent, really accessible. Again, it was produced for their high school level curriculum, so just a little bit of a friendlier way to navigate plant ID when you're just starting out. And Karin also mentioned these ones. So these were written by Kathy Tanis, Common Plants of the Western Rangelands. They're also keys, but extremely, extremely good keys, especially the grass and grass-like key. I've referred to it often when I've been working down in the prairies. So I would recommend these, and they're available through the Olds College bookstore. And then if you are thinking about moving beyond just vascular plants and looking at perhaps mosses, lichens, or ferns, here's a couple of handy resources that we would recommend for those purposes. But it's getting pretty specialized at this point. So you may not start here, but you might end up here. You never know. Okay, so I have just a few minutes left, and I am going to switch gears from my Alberta Native Plant Council hat and put on my Ducks Unlimited Canada hat. I have sort of a special interest in advertising the Alberta Wetland Classification System Field Guide because I actually am the author of this resource. So we released it this summer, and I think that it's relevant and valuable for this audience because when you're working in an agricultural area of Alberta, the case might be that the wetlands are actually where the native plant refuges still exist on that agricultural landscape. So you may find this resource helpful in recognizing and valuing wetlands, but also identifying the plants that you might encounter in these low-lying areas. This field guide is available for free downloads if you just Google it. It's on Ducks Unlimited's website. So it provides an overview of wetlands in Alberta, their distribution and abundance, their functions that are so critical, especially looking at some of the drought situations that we've encountered this year being particularly severe, and also common impacts to wetlands. So for a quick overview of distribution, here's a map, and you'll notice right away that wetlands are extremely common, cover up to 50% of the landscape in the northern boreal regions of the province, and much less common and much smaller and more isolated in the southern grassland areas where they have been heavily impacted. So the field guide will take you through the different classes of wetlands, their different forms and types. And it'll do this using a step-by-step process. So the first step is understanding, is it a wetland? The second is a decision key helping you classify the wetland. And the third are fact sheets for each wetland type. Here's an example of the process that you would use to decide, is it a wetland? You would look at different vegetation, soil, and water characteristics in the site you're looking at. And just a quick reminder too that, you know, there are such things, especially in the boreal, as forested wetlands. So wetlands can come in a lot of different forms. And then here's a quick overview of what the key looks like. We tried to keep it really, you know, simple and accessible. We used common plant species that you may encounter to help guide you through the key. And once you navigate the key, you'll be brought to a different fact sheet for the different wetland type that you are located in. And here's an example of a fen fact sheet. And lots of photos of the different types of fens, just to help you confirm what you're seeing on the ground matches what you're reading in the book. And then back to the plants. So this field guide has a section with over 82 wetland plant species listed using both, you know, common and scientific names. It's not a comprehensive list, but certainly this covers some of the most common wetland plant species present in the province. And here's some screenshots of the different fact sheets for those wetland plant species. Sorry, I didn't realize I had animations on this slide, but there you go. Okay, so that's the field guide in a quick snapshot. Hopefully that's a useful resource for some of you. Getting back to the ANPC, I have our website listed here. I would encourage you to go take a look up all of the resources that I mentioned tonight. Other ways that you might get involved, I would certainly encourage you to consider becoming a member. That way you'll get some of our publications and our newsletter. We run a spring workshop every year. We participate in the annual May plant counts across the province. We run a number of excursions. Hopefully next year there'll be more, including what we call Botany Alberta. So it's a really great way to get out with botanists and get some hands-on experience identifying plants. And we also try and run fall or winter study groups. You know, traditionally these would be in-person events, and the last 2 years we've been on and off running online events. And if you're interested in seeing some of the recordings from last year's study groups, they are available for our members to watch online.